All right. Okay. We are officially live. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Icons with Ava Johanna. I am so looking forward to this conversation today. When we connected via email, actually, I think it was with your team, it was an instant yes for me because over the last, gosh, I want to say 4 years microdosing has been so instrumental in my life and has really changed who I am on a day-to-day basis, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And I, shockingly enough, have not had like an in-depth conversation on the podcast about psychedelics and about microdosing. So there's truly no one better to be having this conversation with than Paul Austin, who is a prominent voice in the realm of psychedelics. He is the founder of Third Wave, the founder of the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. And what, Paul, I'm really excited to talk to you about today is specifically how, one, the world of psychedelics is changing so rapidly, growing in popularity, but also how influential it can be for leaders, for innovators, for visionaries. And so many of the individuals that listen to this podcast fall into that bucket. Yet I've spoken with many of them and they have never even dipped their toes into the world of psychedelics. And I think that
Mm.
a lot of people maybe still have that association from like the 1900s, the 60s, the 70s of the demonization and vilification of psychedelics. I think of, when my mom first told me about psychedelics and her scary story was I knew somebody who took some LSD and they started picking flowers off the wall and went crazy. And that story is still in my head over 15 years later. And so I imagine that many people who have never dipped their toes into this world might have a little bit of hesitation. So I'm just really grateful to have you here so that we can do a little bit of demystifying around the world of psychedelics and really speak to the value and in this growing industry.
I can't wait to dive into it. This has been my professional work for almost 10 years now. I started Third Wave in 2015. And like you said, it's been fascinating to see it go from being this very stigmatized, not a lot of folks really that interested to now, Cal Berkeley just published a study last year, 61% of Americans now support legal psychedelic assisted therapy. So we've seen a massive shift of awareness and interest in these medicines. And it's been great to talk about microdosing very publicly because I think it's a great entry point for a lot of folks who are maybe hesitant to jump off the deep end in more ways than one.
So, I mean, do you think that I want to hear your story and how you got into it,
Yeah.
but I wanted to like just like piggyback off that for a second. Do you feel like because I have a pretty, I would say, traditional relationship with psychedelics where I take a full tab of acid. That's my first experience and just blast
Hmm.
off into the ethers. And I'm like, where did I just go? And can I get off this roller coaster 8 hours later?
Right.
Um, do you think that for somebody listening who is in that position of I've never tried it before, but I'm interested, that microdosing is definitely the way instead of a macrodose?
So, when I started talking about microdosing 9, 10 years ago, it was a pretty recent thing. We've only really known about microdosing for the last 15 years. And so previous to that was, well, as Hunter S. Thompson once said, you buy the ticket, you take the ride. Right. And so there was just this orientation of, well, if I'm going to do psychedelics, then I'm signing up for something and I don't necessarily know where it's going to go. And for folks who haven't done a lot of contemplative practices, maybe, they've never done breath work or they're fairly new to this whole entire space of going into the subconscious and the unconscious, I find that microdosing is a great stepping stone. The metaphor that I often use to describe why microdosing can be so useful is, when many of us learned to swim at a young age, hopefully we didn't just get thrown in the deep end off the diving board. Most of us started in the shallow end. We had a teacher, we had our swimmies on, we learned how to navigate the shallow end before we went deeper and deeper. And I think microdosing offers a similar opportunity for folks to really get a hands-on experience without it being overwhelming or having the potential to be intense or sometimes even traumatizing, because very high doses of psychedelics, if someone isn't appropriately prepared, can sometimes be more detrimental than helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm in the realm of breath work, and I think the same about, intense breathwork journeys. If you go
Right.
into that without having any idea of how to like self-soothe or like have a person around you that can support you, it can be incredibly traumatizing and can scare people away from the incredible healing benefits of these different modalities. Okay, so I'm so curious, how did you get into this space? Like, what's your origin story? I want to hear all about it.
So I first did LSD like you at the age, I don't know how young you did it, but I was 19 when I first did LSD and I did a tab to two tabs. I forget precisely how much, but it wasn't a microdose. And I had been raised in a pretty traditional Midwest family. And what that meant is every Sunday we were at church. Church was sort of the bedrock of our worldview. And, my parents emphasized it was really important. And illegal drugs were not considered to be acceptable. And so at the age of 16, I tried cannabis for the first time. My parents found out soon after that. And they sat me down one Sunday and they basically were like, we can't believe you did this. My dad looked at me and said he hadn't been this disappointed since his brother passed away in a car accident, 30 years prior to that. So it really impacted and affected them that their one son would try an illegal drug. And yet at the same time, I was pretty impressed by the experiences that I had with cannabis. They were interesting, illuminating. I laughed a lot. I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. So in that experience, I learned that if I'm going to continue to explore these more non-conventional states of consciousness, I may have to hide aspects of myself from the people who are closest to me. And so, fast forward a few years after those first experiences with LSD and psilocybin, one of the core teachings that I had was authenticity is paramount. And that if I can't fully accept and love myself, then I can never navigate the world in a way that feels healthy and balanced. And so at the age of 21, as soon as I finished undergrad, I moved abroad and I lived in Turkey for a year where I taught English. And then soon after that, I was living between Chiang Mai, Thailand, and Budapest. This is 2015. Came back into working with psychedelics in Budapest with a couple friends, and we were just reflecting on where the movement was at that point in time. And we noticed that folks like Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan were starting to openly talk about psychedelics on their podcasts, that there was more clinical research coming out of places like Johns Hopkins and NYU, and that cannabis at that point in time had been reevaluated culturally, that it was starting to become legally and recreationally available in many states. And my pulse on the situation was that psychedelics would follow a similar trajectory, that folks would start to wake up to the propaganda of the 50s and 60s. And that the difference between now and the 60s was that instead of it being the counterculture and dropping out and what I would classify as being more intense or irresponsible use, the third wave of psychedelics is really about intentional and informed use. And that if we were going to make this more accessible from a cultural perspective, not just a medical, but a cultural perspective, that we had to lead with something that was less threatening. And so since that day, we've focused on microdosing. Microdosing has been central and essential to my path as well. And the crux of it is I just want to support people in service of their awakening, their transformation, their recognition of how connected they are to the natural world. And so since that point in time, I've just made it my sort of life's mission to ensure that these become responsibly integrated, specifically outside of medical and clinical frameworks, because that's always been my orientation. I didn't necessarily come to psychedelics because I had depression or PTSD or I was struggling with an addiction. It was much more about self-actualization and self-realization. And that to me is the greatest potential of what these medicines offer, is the capacity to recognize how powerful we are and capable we are. And I think that's so necessary at this specific moment in time, because there's a lot that's dying around us, and the entrepreneurs and leaders of what's coming need to be courageous, they need to be adaptable, and they need to have a vision that really supports themselves, their families, their communities, and the natural environment, the world at large.
Mm, yes, 1000%. I mean, I find that through intentional use when it's not targeted towards depression, PTSD, anxiety, that like would you agree that just the ability to contemplate and to feel connected and to be more present and to just like be in your environment is actually, when you take it when you're healthy, will actually prevent getting to the point of depression, anxiety. I mean, PTSD obviously is stimulated by trauma, but like these diseases and these things that are so ingrained into our culture, so much of what where they come from comes from stress and disconnectedness.
Yeah, and I would say even though I didn't have a clinical diagnosis, I wasn't on Prozac or Zoloft or Ritalin or Adderall or I didn't necessarily take benzos for anxiety. I definitely, like so many of us, had anxiety and depression. And what I found with my psychedelic work is that specifically with high doses when done in a very intentional setting that they connected me to something way greater than myself and that allowed for a certain level of equanimity and peace in my everyday life. And then I started to lean into microdosing as a tool to elongate the window of neuroplasticity, because one of the huge benefits with psychedelics is they make us more malleable, right? They make our brain more plastic, and that is so key on the path of anyone who is a seeker or into personal development or into a growth mindset. Is okay, we all recognize, many of us recognize that there's where we are now is not always where we will be, and it's not always where we want to be, that there's sometimes a deeper calling that's pulling us forward, and so many of us are sort of we're stuck in the matrix or caught in the weeds or doing the things that we need to do on a daily basis just to survive and make it. And when you work with psychedelics, they provide a new lens. They help you to zoom out and go, okay, if I wasn't just surviving, but I really wanted to thrive with my life, what would that ask of me? And then how can psychedelics help me to be more courageous in committing to that? And I think that that courage angle is the second big component. The first one I think is the neuroplasticity, but the second one is we often know what we have to do. We're just scared to do it, whether that's a difficult conversation, whether that's a difficult choice or decision in business, whether that is, cutting out toxic patterns or behaviors that no longer serve us. And the challenge is just mustering the courage to actually face ourselves and do it. And I find that psychedelics and especially microdosing can help us to do that on a day-to-day basis.
Can you break that down a little bit more? Like, is there studies or research around like changes that are actually happening in the brain because of microdosing that allows us to be more bold and courageous?
So there's two main mechanisms of action that are happening, let's say neurobiologically with the brain when we start to work with psychedelics. The one that I often focus on is the production of something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is a precursor to neuroplasticity. So there's more and more clinical research coming out that shows there's a direct relationship between psychedelic use, both high doses but also low doses, microdoses, and the production of BDNF. And so when our brain becomes more plastic, then what's really critical is what environment are we in and what choices are we making? And how are those aligned with this higher self or this greater sort of person that we want to become or step into? So the first thing is neuroplasticity, the production of BDNF. There's a lot of other things there, including the activation of something called the 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of 14 serotonin receptors. When that gets activated, it helps to facilitate greater executive functioning in the prefrontal cortex,
Is
which
that like
helps with
5-HTP or similar?
5-HTP would have a similar effect on the brain.
Okay.
5-HTP it is endogenously created, but it's also a supplement that we can take that can help with recovery and balancing our serotonin. So it would have a similar mechanism of action. In fact, kind of like a slight tangent and interesting tidbit, we discovered serotonin in the 60s because of LSD. So we didn't know serotonin even existed as a neurotransmitter until the experiments with LSD in the 50s and 60s. And through those experiments, we were like, what is LSD doing in the brain? oh, it's something to do with this neurotransmitter serotonin. So, in some ways, psychedelics are responsible for the birth of neuroscience as a field in and of
Wow.
itself, which is fascinating and probably worthy of a whole nother conversation. The second part, which is the core question that you ask, which is, how does it help us to become more courageous? So most of your listeners have probably heard of the amygdala. The amygdala is a tiny almond shaped size aspect or part of our brain. It's the reptilian brain. It's really, really deep in the brain. And when we become afraid, when we become fearful, that amygdala gets activated. And that can often prevent us from taking the steps necessary that we need to take. And especially in modern culture where so many of us are in a sympathetic state. We're stuck in fight or flight. We can't really get out of that stressful state. It's hard to really shift off that fear because it keeps us very focused on what am I doing tomorrow? What am I doing for the next week? But I can't really have that vision of what's my greater call in life that I'm being pulled towards. And so when we work with psychedelics, both at low doses and at high doses, that fear response is dampened. So all of a sudden now the amygdala isn't yelling, oh, fight or flight. It's actually saying, no, rest, digest, right? It's activating that parasympathetic nervous system. And that's allowing us to relax, as you mentioned, into the present moment. And when we can fully relax into the present moment, then we can look at things from a point of lucidity and a point of clarity rather than a point of fear, constriction, and sort of the hamster wheel of anxiety that so many of us are stuck on. And so that impact on the amygdala, it can last at high doses, it can last for weeks. At lower doses, typically the way that I'll coach folks is this is a great way in your everyday life just to keep that momentum going so you can continue to keep that sort of higher self that you're stepping into at your forefront and not be held back by the sort of stress of everyday existence.
This is so cool. We got a comment in the chat that says this is so incredibly fascinating. Whoa.
Okay,
And
great.
I'm like, yeah, for sure. And for anybody else that's listening live, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm monitoring it as we go. I love this conversation so much. I'm such a nerd for neuroscience, for just like anything relative to the brain and transformation. Um, I'm curious. So from what you're saying, basically, the microdosing really allows for these big realizations that we've had in like more of a macro dose to just be more and more imprinted into our system because of the ongoing nature of continuously kind of coming back to this space, this, let's call it higher self that we explored and discovered through our macro dose. Would you say that like ideal dream solution slash setting in which someone like really works with these different forms of medicine or these different tools for self-discovery, what would you say is like the ideal way to dive into it? Like how when your clients come to you and work with you, is it like first going on a larger journey and then more of like a prescriptive microdose? I'm so curious like what the ideal is.
Yeah, this is so protocols are an interesting question, and this is what we get into in our training program for practitioners in a lot of depth, which is how do we cultivate the skill of psychedelics. And the way that I look at the skill of psychedelics is just like we can learn to become a better cook or become a better writer or become, a black belt at jujitsu, we can also develop how we work with these medicines in a way that helps to facilitate the intention that we have for our day, our week, our month, our year, our decade, our life, right? And so that skill of psychedelics is composed of three core or ayahuasca or 5-MeO, right? There's a lot of different psychedelic medicines and there's some commonality and overlap between them, but there's also a lot of distinctive differences, which means that we might use a different medicine based on the intention that we have for that experience. The other aspect of it then is how much medicine are we taking, right? Is it a microdose? Is it what I call a medi dose or a museum dose? Or is it like a high dose of a psychedelic that we're looking to work with? And then the final aspect is frequency. And frequency is how often are we doing it, right? So with a high dose, it might be once every 6 months, but with microdosing, it could be 2 or 3 or 4 times a week. And so typically the way that I'll work with someone is we'll do an intake and an assessment. I'll get a sense of, do they have any prior experience? If they don't have any prior experience, then I love to start with something like MDMA or MDMA and psilocybin in combination with one another. If someone's very hesitant to do a high dose immediately, we'll start with lower doses and just have a stair step method where we might do 100 milligrams of psilocybin, which is a classic microdose, and then maybe a half gram of psilocybin, and then maybe a gram of psilocybin. And we'll just slowly start to work our way up until they feel like, okay, now I have enough context or sense of how this is impacting me. Now I want to go into that full experience. For me, the ideal is if someone's stable, they've done a little bit of inner work, they feel ready and prepared to go in. I'll start with a higher dose of psilocybin, usually between 2 and 3 grams, definitely no more than 3 grams, because that can be
For everybody that is here with us live, I'm not sure if you are able to see me, hear me. Let's see. Looks like we lost Paul for a second. The wonders of doing things live, y'all. Oh my goodness. So funny. I'm literally watching back the live stream and just looking at my face in confusion. This is the behind the scenes of being a podcaster. Hopefully, Paul is able to jump back on. This conversation is literally like, it's so stimulating to me. I love it so much. I am fascinated by psychedelics, and I can just riff for a little bit until we get Paul back on. But I first discovered psychedelics as a teenager and definitely went into it with more of macrodose mentality. And they were really big experiences. And I learned very quickly that set and setting is incredibly important, as well as the people that you have around you. And it was a learning experience in my late teens that had me take a step back from ultimately having it be such a big part of my life and my experience because of the intensity that it created and the anxiety that I started to feel going into it. So I'm so curious for those of you that are here live with us, if you have had positive experiences or if you've never tried psychedelics before. It really wasn't until 4 years ago that I learned about microdosing. And that was something that I knew would be really valuable because I'd seen so much research already at that point around depression, around anxiety, around PTSD, and started microdosing. And similar to what Paul said, just 100 milligrams, would take it 4 times a week. And I noticed that my mental health and my emotional health started drastically improving. It was like night and day for me. And that was so fantastic because, especially as a leader or an entrepreneur, we have a lot of stress, lots of stuff that we have to carry, when you're in the beginning stages of building your business, if you have a lot of anxiety or have a history of anxiety, it's something that can become more prominent while you're learning how to be a business owner and dealing with a bunch of different things. And microdosing was just one of those things for me that really changed my life and changed how I interacted with the world. So I'm really excited to be having this conversation. And Paul is back. So let's have him back on. All right, let's see.
Hey, I'm so sorry.
No, you're good. I
It
was
just cut
sharing
out on me.
I was sharing my experience with everybody and
Okay.
just
All right.
amping you up. But
Okay.
I think where you had froze was just the um being with working with somebody who is a little bit more experienced
Yeah.
and starting with a bit of a higher dose.
Yeah. And then having a 45-day microdosing protocol after that, right? Because what happens when we do a higher dose of a psychedelic is it opens up what's called a critical learning period. And so in that learning period, we, like I talked about, we're more plastic. Our brain can, we can make shifts and adapt. And when we microdose after that high dose, it elongates that critical learning period. And so the practical application of that is, well, how long does it take to create a new habit? Typically around 45 days. And so when we're looking at that integration process and actual transformative change, how can we actually commit to a goal or an objective or something that's going to support us in that 45-day window? So different medicines, different amounts, different frequencies. But I would say the simple answer is 2 to 3 grams of psilocybin, followed by like a 45-day microdosing protocol, is typically how I prefer to work with people.
So are there any lasting, I guess, effects either neurologically in the brain or physiologically after using psychedelics for that extended period of time? That was one of the questions that we got in the chat while you were in the ethers. And I'm curious, I mean, obviously, like the new habit forming and neuroplasticity. Is there anything else that's changing in the brain because of that? Because obviously, I know if we're changing our habits, then we're naturally going to be changing parts of the brain just through that. But is there anything else that's happening?
Yeah, another way to look at it is when we're working with a psychedelic, typically a lot of people in our world are very left-brained. And the left brain is responsible for linear thinking, it's responsible for getting shit done, it's responsible for the more masculine aspects of our existence. And almost all of us, not all of us, but almost all of us, are the right side of our brain is like desperately seeking activation. And what activates that? Art, music, dancing, embodiment work. It starts to activate that. And so when we take a high dose of a psychedelic, it's creating greater synchronization between the two hemispheres of the brain. And so, what a lot of people experience is when they work with psychedelics, they start to become more creative, right? They start to become more visionary. They start to understand a process that's called divergent thinking, which is how can you see two things that are seemingly unrelated and look at the synthesis of how they come together. And so, neurologically, we're creating greater connection between the two hemispheres of the brain. And that actually happens with something called dendritic sprouting. So dendrites are what connect neurons. They're what reactivate neurons. And so when we take a psychedelic, it's helping to reactivate those dendrites to create more synchronization between both hemispheres of the brain. The other interesting thing that's happening physiologically is, as I mentioned before, a lot of these classic psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin are serotonergic agonists, meaning they activate the serotonin system. 90% of our serotonin receptors are in our gut, not our brain.
Mm.
And so, we've been learning more and more about the gut brain axis, about the vagus nerve that connects the gut and the brain, how the gut is even a second brain, or some people call it a third brain. And so, what's also happening, and they've done some clinical research, is when we start to take a psychedelic, it's actually helping to lower chronic inflammation. And so
Wow.
chronic inflammation is responsible for a lot of lifestyle diseases, right? And when we become more stressed, when we're constantly in that fight or flight, our chronic inflammation is naturally much higher. And so psychedelics, by interrupting that process, help to lower that chronic inflammation, which then creates, think of it as like we're taking out the trash, right? It creates more space in the body. It creates a cleaner, freer environment, which allows us to be healthier, more energetic, to have a better mood, all these sorts of things are related to how it impacts serotonin in the gut as well. So there's a lot that we're still learning about this physiological impact and the neurological impact. And I think it's so exciting because what psychedelics represent for a lot of people is this recognition that the mind and body are not disconnected, that they are one. And the more we can treat the mind and the body as one, the healthier, more balanced, more energetic we become.
Preaching to the choir. I love this so
Yeah.
much. Okay, so I'm imagining anybody listening to this is wondering, okay, well, what about access? And I saw a post on your page recently around how I think it was like 5 million or 4 million people in the United States did psilocybin in 2023, and like 99.9% of that was illegal, meaning that it was not it wasn't through John Hopkins, it wasn't a like with a practitioner, it was illegally purchased and illegally consumed, um, which I get because that's how I get all my psychedelics.
Same. Yeah.
So it makes sense. So I guess for the person, like for example, someone in the chat is saying, I've only done psilocybin once. So for somebody like that who's like, okay, I'm listening to this, like this sounds amazing, but like, where do I get it? Where do I get it? How do I get it? How do I trust it? You know, I think another post that I saw that you said was like your psychedelic journey would have started with ketamine if you could go back and like do the perfect. Obviously, we've got gosh, how am I not thinking about it right now? What's that crazy fentanyl? Like
Yeah.
fentanyl is running rampant. So how do we access these transformative materials without having the fear of an overdose or getting something that is laced with something that is really dangerous for us?
So I'll take that in a few different ways, which is what I'd love to start with is where is it legal? Because there has been a lot of great legal change in the last few years. So for example, in Oregon, you can now go to Oregon and legally work with psilocybin mushrooms. There are licensed service centers that you can go into. You can work with licensed facilitators. So anyone who's listening to this, you could book a flight tomorrow to Oregon and be doing mushrooms this weekend if you're like really committed. I would not recommend that. Take some time to prepare, but that is like a total option nowadays, which a lot of Americans don't know about, that you can legally do this in Oregon. Colorado has also legalized all plant medicine. So psilocybin, ayahuasca, San Pedro, iboga. You can legally go to Colorado and work with these substances there. Now, again, the vast majority of people are not doing that. The vast majority of people like you and I, we either have a direct relationship with someone who supplies this, or what's becoming more prevalent is a lot of people are growing their own mushrooms. So even on third wave, we have a mushroom grow kit, which fits in a drawer. It takes at the most 6 weeks to grow your own mushrooms. It's a very simple and easy process. It's not like growing cannabis or more complex things. It's actually really, really easy to grow mushrooms. So a lot of people nowadays, they're just saying, I'm going to do this myself. I'm going to grow my own mushrooms. And that's what I would say probably like 5% of people are doing is they're going, okay, yeah, I can just grow it in my own home. Let's do that. What the vast majority of people are doing is they're existing in this black market, right? And the challenge with the black market is precisely what you talked about, which is there's no oversight and there's no regulation. The vast majority of the supplements that are being sold, like the microdosing supplements, are totally safe. However, there's been some news lately over the last month to 6 weeks where there was a chocolate bar that was portrayed as a mushroom chocolate, but it actually had a different type of mushroom in it that was causing seizures and other complications for people. And so I've started a 501c3 nonprofit called the Microdosing Collective, where we are focused on how do we change regulatory policy to ensure that we can bring the underground microdosing market in particular above ground. So people know that this is third party lab tested. They know precisely what they're getting, they know what's in it. For the time being, it does take, I would say, relationship building, a certain degree of, I'll call it mycelial networking, and also the recognition that, you know, the you mentioned fentanyl, right? The DEA is so focused on fentanyl that they have essentially even publicly stated they are not interested in psychedelics. And so what's happening is you have all of these suppliers who are starting to come online. And so what we've even done at Third Wave is we have a sourcing guide that essentially folks can download. It's a PDF and it will point you in the right direction of what are trustworthy suppliers that you can look to if you're looking to start with microdosing psilocybin, as an example. Because the biggest risk of psychedelic use is the fact that they're illegal, right?
Mhm.
Psilocybin is the safest drug that we have. It's safer than alcohol. It's safer than cannabis. It's safer than tobacco. It's obviously much safer than cocaine and heroin. But the biggest risk is that it's still illegal. And so recognizing that there's now this space between where there's a massive market and what's important is just the discernment around where am I getting this? Who am I getting this from? Fentanyl is not so much a concern with psilocybin. I think it can be a concern with MDMA if someone is buying white powders underground, right? Always test MDMA if you're accessing it underground or if you're getting ketamine underground, which I don't recommend because it's so cheap to do legally. But if you are, always test white powders. With psilocybin, the bigger risk is like if you're buying a chocolate bar, you don't know what's in it. And so it's
Right.
better to buy supplements. It's better to buy the real mushroom. It's ideal to grow your own mushrooms because you know where the source is coming from. So there's a lot of nuance and context there, but I'd say it's obviously easier than it ever has been before to get your hands on psilocybin if someone's interested in a microdosing journey.
Yeah, I mean, even 4 years ago when I first started microdosing, there was like so many loopholes to find a person that would supply. And now I literally, before we hopped on this, some random person sent me a message and said, "We've got all these specials." And I'm
Right.
like,
Yeah.
"Where'd you get my phone number from?"
Right.
But this is super helpful. And I think that it's exciting because even though I know that there's probably still a lot of hoops that you have to jump through in order to get to the point where it's legalized, across the nation, that it is inevitable in the same way that weed has gotten to that point. I'm excited. I'm invested in different companies and researchers, and my stocks haven't gone up yet, but one day they will. I've
Maybe in 2 weeks. So I think the other exciting news that we haven't talked about yet is the FDA is potentially on the verge of approving MDMA to treat PTSD.
Ooh,
And,
okay.
and and so in 2 weeks we'll have a decision. So there's an organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They've been around a long time. For the past 15 years, they've been doing clinical research on MDMA for PTSD. The results are outstanding, and the FDA is.
I'm not going to be a conspiracy theorist, y'all, but is the internet spying on our conversation? Is the conversation too transformational to be on YouTube? Who knows? I don't know. But hopefully, Paul is able to come back on and share the news around regulations. I don't know if Mercury is in retrograde. Who knows? Who knows what's happening, y'all? For those of you that are here live, I hope that you are enjoying this conversation as much as me. There we go. Paul's back.
I'm giving up on my Wi-Fi.
No
It's
problem.
I was just saying MDMA to treat PTSD by August 9th. That's it. massive win for psychedelics. They've been working on this for years, and it'll be basically the first time the FDA has approved a classic psychedelic to treat PTSD. And we're very hopeful that it will go through because that will be a great boon for the veterans. Even, there's 22 veterans that commit suicide every day. We haven't had any new PTSD treatments in over 20 years. And so just to have that accessibility to a medicine that really works legally could be a life, literally a life-saving treatment for thousands and thousands of veterans and also sexual assault survivors who also struggle with PTSD.
Yeah, I mean, just even as you're saying that, I'm like the ripple effect of that because, and I mean, I don't know what your beliefs are, where you stand on this, but growing up in California and Los Angeles, Southern California area, seeing the increase in the unhoused over the last decade, I mean, it's been really heartbreaking. And, so many people say it's a housing problem, it's a housing problem. But if you go and walk on the streets anywhere in Southern California, much like the Bay Area, it's not a housing problem, it's a mental health problem. And a lot of those that are unhoused are veterans that have extreme
Right,
PTSD. And so, just like even
right.
thinking about the ripple effect of them getting access to a treatment that can really help them with the trauma that is stored within the body from their experience serving our country, I might add, like,
Yeah,
I think it's huge.
and it speaks to like how mental health not just individual, it's also collective. And we were talking earlier about how psychedelics can help us to feel more connected. And certainly for people in leadership positions, this is also true. I know a lot of CEOs and founders and entrepreneurs, and I myself have been one, and I myself still go through this from time to time where burnout is a real thing. A lot of navigating stress and becoming more resilient is a real thing. And what I've come to learn is having a community to lean into, a community where you feel loved, seen, and accepted is essential to that. And that used to be church, for better or worse, for hundreds of years. And for many of us, that's no longer the case because we can't handle the dogma and a lot of the brainwashing. But there has to be a new thing that it is. And I think psychedelics are they're in a way pointing a way forward that's actually very ancient. And I
Mm.
think that combination of ancient wisdom in a modern context is really soul sickness that so many Westerners struggle with.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, at least like from my perspective, a lot of the psychedelic culture that I have been around in the past has been kind of tied to festivals and has been a little quirky and out there and
Right,
very, very esoteric.
right.
And so I love this idea of bringing like the ancient into the modern because, a lot of high achievers, a lot of leaders, a lot of CEOs, aren't going to resonate with that more esoteric, quirky, psychedelic culture. So like this new wave and this new community and this new collective where it's incorporated into everyday life, but not like pulling us out of everyday life, I think is really valuable.
Yeah, and there's a place for these transcendent experiences at festivals, and there's not a lot of containment in that. And so a lot of people, if they only are taking psychedelics at festivals, that's where a lot of these bad trips, quote unquote, happen because it can be so overwhelming. There's usually alcohol or drugs involved. And so that's why when I started many years ago, the focus was what are these intentional spaces that we're creating? And also even why a few years ago I started a training program for practitioners because now that a lot of people are waking up to psychedelics and they're starting to use them, the next question is how do you train ethical, skillful practitioners to help folks navigate that how to be skillful ethical practitioners to navigate the space. I think that's the final mountain to climb.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as someone who trains practitioners and facilitators myself, I think although it's not psychedelics, it is slightly a psychedelic experience being the breath. And so much of like this work comes down to set and setting and who's actually holding you during these transformational experiences or sometimes these intense experiences. So I really love what you're doing and respect what you're doing with the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. I know that you also recently authored a book called Mastering Microdosing. Is that available everywhere? Is this like a good place for people to start to dive into your world?
Yeah, microdosing is a place for folks to start.
Is your book Mastering Microdosing a good place for people to start just like diving into your world?
Yeah, it's a great place for people to start is check out Mastering Microdosing and go to thethirdwave.co, check out our resources, and then ping me. If folks have questions, I'm on social, I'm on Instagram and Twitter. And I just appreciate you creating this platform and also for your patience because I don't know if it's Mercury retrograde or if my I'm just having a bad day, but I'm just so sorry for some
Oh
of the
no,
technical issues
you're
and
good.
navigating the
When you hopped off, I was like, I think that the internet's trying to stop us from getting this
yeah,
information out.
yeah. It's a conspiracy. Yeah, I like
Yeah.
that.
Paul, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We're going to make sure to link everything for everyone in the YouTube comments as well as in the show notes. Everyone that is listening, please go check him out. Give him a follow on Instagram. I really love your page. It's such an insightful resource for the world of psychedelics. And I'm just really excited to continue following along. So thank you so much for coming.